Greetings from the Erie Coast. This is Mad Shad. This is episode 2 of Tactics, the Mangudai, from the Basic School of Marine Corps Development and Education Command, Quantico, Virginia, 22134. Basic School, Spear, Leadership, Knowledge. Anyway, yes, to continue. So, when the news spread throughout the Gobi Desert that Yassutai was expanding the Mangudai, the three companies, and organizing 3,000 volunteers, many candidates hastened to apply. Veterans who were on the verge of discharge, and great numbers of youths who had no military service at all. This time, no volunteers were turned away. Instead, all the prospects were taken on a 6-day journey during which they were given no food, only water. Rest was progressively decreased from 6 hours on the first day to 5 hours on the second, 4 on the third, 3 on the fourth, 2 on the fifth, and 1 on the sixth. On the 7th day of the screening process, an attack and encirclement exercise was carried out. All of the volunteers who had been able to withstand this grueling evaluation and were still willing to serve in the Mangudai were sworn into one of the 3 new companies. In a short while, the ranks of the 3 new companies were filled, but volunteers kept applying. Genghis Khan then decided to leave the ranks of the Mangudai open, unlimited by any formal size or framework. Therefore, although the numbers of regular army units varied according to the military needs of the Khan, the Mangudai units were a permanent military order, limited only by the number of warriors who volunteered for them. The full impact of the Mangudai potential first became evident during the Mongol invasion of the Cathay Empire in 1211. The full scope of the campaign against the Cathay is somewhat difficult to grasp. For each Mongol horseman Genghis Khan was able to put on the field, Cathay was able to match them between 300,000 to 500,000 men. Many of these were undoubtedly non-combatants, but they still composed a large body of troops for less than 100,000 warriors to oppose. I guess that's how many Genghis had. The Chinese commanders were masters of the arts of military strategy and tactics, and the Chinese soldiers who were hardened and well-trained had triumphed in the past over the tribes from the Gobi Desert. The struggle to conquer Cathay lasted for more than 4 years, but the deciding blow was struck in its first battle. An engagement between the Mongolian Army Corps commanded by Chepe Noyan and over 250,000 Chinese warriors. Wow. The Arrow Lord had led his force in a rapid march which placed them in the rear of the Chinese army, which was made up primarily of infantry along with some cavalry brigades. And in addition, there were artillery and engineering units who were responsible for the employment of stone-throwing catapults and Chinese fire, an incendiary liquid hurled in split bamboo reeds. All of the Mongol warriors were horsemen. Many of them were somewhat uneasy facing this sea of Chinese soldiers. Chepe Noyan called his officers together and explained that there was but one path for them. They must score a definite victory over the Chinese. The alternative would be disastrous not only for them, but for all of the Mongol armies in the field. So the Arrow Lord had decided to attack. The Mangudai officers were quiet, as though they were about to engage in a routine exercise rather than the most decisive battle of the war. Chepe Noyan looked at them and thought to himself, if the entire corps were like the Mangudai company, victory would be assured. But he realized he would have to make do with what men who were not at all prepared for the same sort of self-sacrificing actions as the Mangudai. While Chepe Noyan was explaining the details of the plan of attack to his officers, Yassutai arrived at the Arrow Lord's headquarters with a small band of hand-picked Mangudai from Genghis Khan. They had been sent especially to join Chepe Noyan's vastly outnumbered force. The sudden appearance of the leader of the Mangudai had a decidedly reassuring effect on the officers commanding the reserve units. Chepe Noyan finished explaining his plan of action and answered several questions from his officers when one of them asked Yassutai to say a few words. Yassutai took a deep breath, exhaled it slowly, and said, "Do you smell the fragrance of flowers in the air?" The officers sat in silence for a few moments, glancing nervously at each other before the same officer who had originally asked Yassutai to speak said, "I meant to ask you your opinion about the battle we're about to begin." Yassutai answered, shaking his head. Poor Chinese. Too bad for them. They haven't a chance, of course. One of the reserve officers, a gray-haired veteran who had fought the Chinese on the lofty wind-swept plateaus of the Gobi, spoke up. "Permit me to inquire, why do you think so? They are known to be capable warriors. They are defending the land under which their fathers are buried. Their overwhelming superiority in numbers defies description." Yassutai spoke. "No, I'm sorry. No, this is the same guy speaking. When I was a boy, long before Genghis Khan rose to power, the Chinese came to our plateaus, lying close to the clouds, on punitive expeditions against the desert clans. We were never able to withstand the fury of their assaults. Do not misunderstand me, Yassutai. We shall fight like lions, but I do not believe underestimating our enemy will help us defeat them." Yassutai answered, "What you say is true, but you have forgotten a single small detail that completely alters the situation." Another prolonged period of nervous silence ensued until the gray-haired veteran spoke again. "And what small detail have I overlooked?" Yassutai smiled and said, "The Mangudai. No matter how many they be, no matter what they do, the Chinese will never overcome the Mangudai." The Mangudai officers present sat passively. They did not presume to enter into a discussion with a warrior like Yassutai, especially in the presence of Chepe Noyan, the Arrow Lord, who was one of Genghis Khan's most intimately trusted generals. It says Orkhans, but generals. Among the officers of the reserves, however, were many tribal Khans who were accustomed to speaking their minds. And one of them asked Yassutai, "Why do you think the Mangudai cannot be conquered?" Yassutai paused before replying. "That which is consecrated to God cannot yield before human force." So, the Mongols attacked at dawn. The Mangudai fought as only the Mangudai knew how to fight, in a furiously destructive onslaught. They burst in upon the churning tide of Chinese soldiers and annihilated all who stood in their way. The Chinese hurled burning oil on the Mangudai, and many of the warriors literally caught fire, but not a single one left his mount to extinguish the flames. With iron wills, they maintained control of their horses and continued to fight, continued to hack through and decimate the closed ranks of the enemy until the burning animals died beneath their flaming riders. Dismounted, they continued to give battle on foot, slashing away at the Chinese until they were killed or toppled or scorched to death from the burning oil. This fierce sortie of the Mangudai, wrapped in flames, broke the Chinese defense. The army of Cathay considered burning oil their most deadly weapon. The Chinese soldiers have never seen an enemy struck with the fire who continued to attack. When the Mangudai came upon them without clothes or hair or skin, their bare flesh blackened with the burns, and still wielding their terribly destructive swords with scorched arms, terror seized the Chinese. They fled in panic, ran into another Chinese unit coming up to beat off the attack. And in the ensuing confusion, they were easily cut down by the Mongol horsemen. Chepe Noyan had made sure his men were well versed in techniques on preventing an enemy's escape, and the Mongols, led by the arrow lords, set about the task of destroying the Chinese with a grim relish. The few that invaded death filled the relief columns of Chinese troops with fear as they described the shockwave of Mangudai that had crashed through their lines. Genghis Khan knew how to exploit success. He often said the merit of an action is in finishing it to the end. He quickly followed Chepe Noyan's victory with a series of lightning bolts that irretrievably shattered the might of the Kathidi Empire. Still, he lacked the means and the numbers to conquer their walled cities, and when autumn came, he retired to the barren plains of the Gobi. 4 times the Mongols of Genghis Khan returned to China in the spring to slaughter, steal, ravage, and destroy. Genghis Khan wanted once and for all time to heave the Chinese yoke from the necks of the Gobi clans, as well as to even an old score with the Kathi Empire. 3 times the Mongols returned to the wind-swept plateaus of the Gobi. Yep. Sorry, it's not printed well. 3 times the Mongols returned to the wind-swept plateaus of the Gobi in the fall after having failed to take Kathi. Yanking or any other fortified city. I don't know. It was only in the invasion of 1214 that the capital city fell to the Mongols, and the task was accomplished by a great extent through the efforts of Yassutai and 20 Mangudai warriors. You going to tell us about it? What? No, I guess not. Genghis Khan was already on his way to the Gobi Desert when he was informed that the ruler of Kathi had left Yanking. Oh, I guess Yanking is a city. Wanking. I thought they were... Whatever. Anyway, had left Yanking and fled south to the Sung Kingdom. At once, Genghis Khan sent a brigade after the Chinese sovereign and ordered Muhuli, the Jalair, who had been moving with 5,000 men to the Mongol rear, to return to the city of Yanking and renew the siege. The Mongols' return caused a wild rush of Chinese back to the safety of the walls of Yanking. Yassutai and his men disguised themselves as Chinese peasants, and by galloping day and night without rest, they managed to join the flow of refugees. Their horses died of the efforts, and the last leg of the journey was made on foot. They reached the gates of Yanking and were allowed through. They passed under the careful scrutiny of the guards separately. The 2 last neglected to obey Yassutai's instructions not to undergo the inspection at the gate together, and one of them happened to utter a word in Mongolian. The guards killed him and all the real Chinese peasants that happened to be next to him at that moment. A lesson on infiltration there. As the troops of the aged Muhuli approached Yanking, the gates of the city were bolted shut. The Chinese troops took up their positions on the walls surrounding the city and prepared to undergo an extended siege, but that was not to be. Yassutai waited until Muhuli's forces reached the walls of the city before he dispatched his men to different districts in the city. Using the same burning liquid that had been the main Chinese weapon of defense in previous sieges, the Mongols set buildings on fire, and within a short while, billowing columns of smoke were rising throughout the city. At the same time, Yassutai's men spread rumors that the Mongols were already fighting within the walls. The masses began to plunder the houses of the nobles and empty the warehouses. Many Chinese soldiers left their post in order to participate in the mass looting and stealing. In a few hours, Yanking, the magnificent capital city of Kathi, became a nightmare of pillage, rape, murder, and suicide. That's all them doing it. Just a few little rumors and a fire. The Mangudai inside the city seized one of the gates at the wall, opened it, and the warriors of Muhuli, the Jalar, poured through. 4 years of frustration were vented on the city in 2 days. For 2 days, uncontrolled vengeance flowed through the streets of Yanqing, leaving blood and horror in its wake. But the nightmare of violence was to end as suddenly as it was spawned. A messenger rode up to Muhuli and handed him a directive from the Khakan. The instructions were clear. Muhuli had been appointed ruler of Kathi, and Genghis Khan instructed him to institute the Yasa Code throughout the conquered territory. In addition, he was to begin thrusting into the Sung kingdom of southern China in preparation for conquest of that land as well. Immediately, Muhuli ended the unrestrained terror of the Mongol conquerors, and the unyielding discipline of the Yasa brought order and security not only to the fallen city of the Yanqing, but to the entire conquered empire of Kathi. Once the Yasa was established throughout the vast territory, Muhuli initiated a series of reconnaissance thrusts into the Sung kingdom. These reconnaissance missions were extremely dangerous. In addition, Muhuli preferred to avoid the requisitioning of food from the native population, which was the routine method of acquisition in such cases. Because of their renowned capability to ride for days without food or rest, as well as their demonstrated courage, the Mangudai were assigned the task of performing the excursions into the Sung kingdom. Muhuli had originally intended for Yassutai to personally lead these reconnaissance missions, but Yassutai had grown weary of the crowded centers of population and civilization in China. He longed for the high plateaus of the Gobi. He missed their windswept sparseness and their reed-fringed lakes visited by migratory birds. He ached for the calm and the peace and the solitude of the high desert on which he had taken his first breath. So he told Muhuli that he had to go back to Genghis Khan, and with a small troop of Mangudai, he made his way back to Karakorum and presented himself before the emperor of all men. The Khakan, Genghis, was indeed glad for he had need of the Mangudai leader. Man, I should have read this. Taking a break. I should have read this. Rewrote it. It is horrible. Who the fuck wrote this? I'm just curious. I really am curious. Leave it to the Marines, right? Quantico, Virginia. Whatever. Anyway. When Genghis Khan returned from Kathi, he learned that Guchluk, a Naimani prince who had been defeated in a previous war with the Mongols, had gained control of the Turkish peoples of Central Asia as far as the mountains of Tibet. At this point, Guchluk was threatening the young Mongol nation, and Genghis Khan sent part of his army into the field to end the threat. However, the Genghis Khan did not personally take part in the campaign against Guchluk. Instead, he assigned two of his most distinguished generals, Subutai of the Uri, Urankhi, and Chepe Noyan, the Arrow Lord, with the task of crushing the rebellion. Subutai was sent with a brigade to restore the population to the Mongol Empire, and Chepe Noyan was given 2 brigades to hunt down Guchluk and send his corpse to Genghis Khan in Karakorum. Yassutai was attached to Chepe's troops, not as commander of the Mangudai companies, but in an unspecified capacity, with about 30 selected Mangudai fighters to carry out special tasks, special forces. After the exploits of the Mangudai at the city of Yanqing, Yassutai had been granted the privilege of being able to pick his own assignments. Considering Yassutai had no specific rank or position in the army, his privilege granted by Genghis Khan was a rare honor. Damn, no rank. Guchluk retreated to the Tibetan mountains, and Chepe Noyan followed. However, the Mongolian cavalry was not suited to perform in the steep terrain, and the Arrow Lord was unable to close with the rebels. After a year of futile pursuit, Chepe realized he could never be able to force Guchluk into an open engagement. He had invited Yassutai and the other Mangudai officers to his tent and went over the situation. He stated that Guchluk would always be able to evade the large Mongol force, but he believed a small, swift force might be able to catch him, and he wanted suggestions. Yassutai immediately answered, "Very simple. Some of us, disguised as natives, could penetrate Guchluk's camp and slay him in his headquarters." Damn. The Arrow Lord was skeptical. "Will not the guards easily discover that you are not Tibetans? Guchluk has a well-organized army of veteran warriors. Do not think the situation is the same as it was in Yanking." Yassutai explains, "I have managed to learn enough Tibetan to be able to present myself as a native to the guards," replied Yassutai. "I have also become familiar with several of the Tibetan tribes, and I believe I could undergo their cross-examination. Do not forget that Guchluk's men are not themselves Tibetans, and would have no reason to doubt us should we appear in native dress." "There are Tibetans among Guchluk's troops," the Arrow Lord responded. The confident Yassutai answered, Shit. Okay. The confident Yassutai answered, "Each tribe has its peculiar accent. I shall manage." "Very well," Chepe Nolan reluctantly agreed. "Who do you need to accompany you?" After a moment's pause, Yassutai said, "I shall not need anyone." The Arrow Lord nodded his head in agreement. There was no point in endangering more lives than necessary. After all, Genghis Khan has sent only Gudar with the standard of 9 yak tails to confuse the Karaits at Mount Gupta. "When will you be ready to depart?" he asked Yassutai. Yassutai, "Whenever you wish," answered the Mangudai leader. "Even now." Tibetan dress and a native horse were procured for Yassutai, and unarmed, he left for Guchluk's encampment. 3 days of steady riding brought him to the vicinity of the rebel camp. He had arrived in the evening, and he could see the campfires from a distance. Approaching boldly on a rocky pathway, he soon encountered some sentries. Yassutai was grabbed off his mount and flung to the ground. He was quickly searched for any hidden weapons, bound and taken at spear point to an officer who questioned him. "Who are you?" "Take me to Prince Guchluk," answered Yassutai. "Who are you?" "I have an important message for Prince Guchluk. I must be taken to him," said Yassutai. Guards. "First you shall tell me who you are, who sent you here, and what your message is," striking Yassutai full in the face as he spoke. "I am but a messenger. I come here for a promised reward of 2 swift horses. The message I bring is from Chepe Noyan, the Arrow Lord, and is sent in the name of Genghis Khan." The officer sent Yassutai into Guchluk's encampment with an escort of 6 warriors. But he was not sent to Prince Guchluk. He was sent to the officer in command of the guard, who demanded to know what the message intended for the rebel leader was. Yassutai answered, "My message is for Prince Guchluk." The officer struck Yassutai a mighty blow in the face and shouted, "You will speak to me, and you will do it so quickly. I have no patience for the likes of you." Ignoring the bright red blood flowing from his nostrils and lips, Yassutai calmly answered, "When Prince Gutschlik hears the message I bring and learns you tried to stop me from delivering it, he will have you put to death." The guard officer struck Yassutai in the face again, but then turned to his men and said, "Take hold of this cur and follow me." What's a cur? C-U-R. Anyway. He led them to the magnificent tent, more like a pavilion than the simple yurt that the Mongols, exchanged a few words with the guards at the entrance and went in. A few minutes passed, and another officer came out and ordered the soldiers to bring Yassutai into the tent. There were over 30 fully armed officers and men in the tent. Prince Gutschlik was the only one sitting. Yassutai was thrown to the ground at his feet. The rebel leader looked down at the bound Mangudai leader and demanded, "What is it you have to tell me?" Yassutai rose to his feet and answered, "I am a messenger sent by Chepe Noyan, the Arrow Lord, with the terms of peace dictated by the Emperor of all men, Genghis Khan. He has but one condition, but I shall not speak it so long as I am bound in this humiliating position as though I were a common thief." Gutschlik said, "You will speak when I command." Yassutai stood silent, and the rebel prince gestured for one of the officers. Some of the soldiers present moved forward, and for over half an hour they beat Yassutai mercilessly with wooden clubs. The Mangudai showed no sign of being in pain, nor any inclination of speaking his message. Gutschlik instructed the officers to end the beating. He stood and walked towards Yassutai, sneering, "You are no Tibetan. You are one of the Mangudai of Genghis Khan. No Tibetan would have suffered these blows and still refuse to speak. You have a message. You are a spy sent by the Mongol dogs who bay at our heels." Yassutai looked out of swollen blackened eyes at the rebel leader. "You are mistaken. You underestimate us Tibetans. We too have our honor, and you may kill me, but I shall not speak so long as I am bound like a criminal." Gutschlik turned to the officers who had overseen the beating and said, "We shall see if silver will loosen his tongue. Melt some coins and pour the liquid in his eyes." Yassutai shouted, "The time you waste now will be your undoing. Even now the warriors of Chepe Noyan are moving to encircle your encampment. You will be well advised to hear the offer of Genghis Khan." Gutschlik stopped the officers who were preparing the molten silver and ordered, "Untie him." The soldiers loosened his bonds, and Yassutai said nothing. Instead, he rubbed his wrist and opened and closed his hands a few times. "Speak now," commanded Gutschlik. The actions with which Yassutai responded spoke louder than any words he could have possibly uttered. He pulled a sword from the scabbard of a stunned soldier, leapt on Gutschlik, and decapitated the rebel leader with a single stroke. Standing in the blood gushing from the corpse, Yassutai grasped the severed head by the hair and held it aloft, saying quietly, "Genghis Khan has a single condition for peace: the head of Gutschlik. Throw down your arms and surrender to Chepe Noyan, who will arrive here momentarily." The 30 fully armed officers and the men in the tent had been overwhelmed by what they had seen. For a few moments they stood frozen in shock. Then they were suddenly gripped with hysteria and burst from the tent crying, "Run for your lives! The Mongols are coming!" Ah! In the confusion and panic that followed, Yassutai was able to make his way out of the rebel encampment. He was able to return to the Arrow Lord's camp with Gutchlug's head and the news that his followers, gripped by fear, had scattered in all directions. Chepe Noyan's forces proceeded to hunt them down. It was only a short while before the remnants of Gutchlug's army had been slaughtered in the Tibetan mountains that had shielded them for so long. After all semblance of the rebel force had been destroyed, Chepe Noyan sent news of its elimination, along with a gift of 1,000 Tibetan horses and the head of Gutchlug to Genghis Khan in his capital city in Karakokum. The emperor of all men was pleased at the result of the lengthy campaign. So was Chepe Noyan. The Arrow Lord called Yassutai to his tent and asked him if there was anything he desired as a reward for the extraordinary accomplishments of assassinating Gutchlug in his headquarters. The Mangudai leader reflected for a bit and then said that he could think of nothing. Chepe Noyan instructed Yassutai to ponder the question a while longer and to inform him of the next morning of what he wanted as a reward. Yassutai did not appear before Chepe Noyan the next morning, and so the Arrow Lord sent for him. "Don't be modest. Please, tell me what you want, Yassutai." "The truth is, I do not want anything at all," Yassutai answered, and he was silent, and he was sincere. Chepe was like, "What are the things you like best?" Yassutai pondered for a minute. The leader of the Mangudai sat quietly for several moments and replied, "To lie on my back in the open and look at the clouds." Thus concludes the Mangudai. Yeah. I hope you enjoyed it. So, these are the kind of things that they it was required reading, the commandant's reading list, if you will, for infantry and stuff. Clearly, Yassutai, just as a summary, a lot of names have been changed. Obviously, the author of this was absolutely terrible, but he got the message across. You know, and if you look at a lot of history of the Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan and Yassutai, it's hard to find Yassutai in. It's only found in the chronicles of the Mongol. They kept a chronicle of everything from the beginning of Genghis Khan, his origins, until the very, very bitter end, and they chronicalized everything. The Mongolians did. So that's the only place that you find Yassutai in the Mangudai. They were fierce warriors, much like the berserkers of the Vikings. But just thought I'd share that with you. I've had this for years, since the 90s. And now my dog requires her treat. Yes, Charity. Okay. So, this is Mad Shad. Encouraging you all to continue to prep, continue to train, because it is a mad, mad world out there. And it helps to be a little mad yourself.